Oh, I don't need my nerdy glass just for the look at the phone. Hello, Hari Om, everybody. Thank you for being here to one more segment of our Cosmic Wisdom School. For some of you that are new and don't know, I started this online school during COVID, and we had about 8 classes that they're all recorded there on my website. If any of you have interest, the classes are about Soundaraya Lahari chant, one of the most important tantric texts. And we have about yoga. We have techniques about creating potions and herbalism and nutrition, sound healing, and some invite teachers as well, and all kinds of goodies. So thank you for being here. This is the 7th class, if I'm not mistaken, of the 2nd series of the Cosmic Wisdom School. We have been working now with the mind in the 2nd season. So the first class was about the mind. What is mind? What is consciousness? The 2nd class was about what is superconsciousness and ESP, extrasensorial perceptions. The 3rd class, we were talking about shamanism. 4th class was about hypnotherapy. The 5th class was about pranayama, the subtle body. The 6th class was about using the chakras as maps of consciousness, yoga, and psychology. So today we're going to continue in this theme of psychology. And I'm going to introduce you to our guest teacher today. Ta-da! It's very interesting. I don't know how to spell or pronounce correctly the second name of my own partner. Ó Cobhthaigh. So Rob Ó Cobhthaigh with you, ladies and gentlemen, and introducing here our guest teacher of today. And yeah, I think I'm going to pass it on to you. Just to explain, this is like a talk, is a lecture. And I think Rob can introduce himself and all his trainings and his expertise. But it's such a pleasure and an honor to have him with us and have a little more like an academic teacher with us today. And yeah, so usually I do this a 1-hour talk and a little moment for meditation, for practice of some kind. And then we always end this practice with the answers, questions and answers, and also with the oracle card. So today for our oracle card, I have the Jungian oracle about the archetypes. Every class is also a different oracle, and today, because we're inspired by psychology, I just thought to take one of those cards that we're going to read in the end for our collective. So thank you, Rob. I'll pass it on this beautiful mic to you. Talking stick.
Huge mic. Okay, just bear with me while I share the screen. Okay, welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be speaking about psychological maps of consciousness, and maybe at the end a little bit about metaphysical maps of consciousness. Yeah, I'm by training, I'm a psychotherapist, a Jungian psychotherapist and transpersonal therapist. I have a deep interest in maps. Simon, my old friend, is on this call. We were whitewater kayakers back in the day. We explored the geographical realms. And probably the past 10 or 15 years, I've been exploring the inner worlds. And, you know, for me, they're related. Yeah, maps. Let's have a look. So I'm going to try and make this as interactive as possible. I'll be speaking for about 50 minutes or so. And I want, yeah, as much engagement as we can have. So does anyone have an idea what this might be? I'm beginning by a metaphor, by way of metaphor. Anyone? Any idea what it might look like? You can unmute yourself.
Ancient map of Great Britain.
Yes.
Oh, Great Britain, like what was it back in the days? Britannia.
Yes, you're kind of correct. It is an ancient map. It's an ancient map of Ireland. I'm not going to take it personally, but it's an ancient map of Ireland from about 2,000 years ago. Ptolemy, a Greek map of Ireland from 2,000 years ago. And my question for anyone in this audience not been to Ireland, maybe put up your hand. Anyone not been to Ireland?
All of you?
Okay. I'm asking a question. If you haven't been to Ireland, how do you know that this is a map of Ireland? How do we know geographical maps are a representation of a real place if you've never been there before? And I suppose I was pondering this question, and the answer I feel is that a geographical map is a representation of a place. And even if we've never been there, we can trust that there's many thousands of generations of human beings that tell us that this place exists. And therefore we associate in our mind, when we see a map, we are, we can trust it to a degree that this is a place that exists in real life. A map, of course, is not the territory, and a map will only show a small fraction of what actually is real in a place. Yeah. And the reason I'm mentioning this, it's because it's the same for psychological maps of consciousness. This is a geographical map. A psychological map of consciousness is the terrain that has been mapped by many generations of psychologists, of mystics, of explorers of the inner world. So today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about these maps of consciousness. And yeah, I'm going to cover quite a few of them, and some will resonate and some will not, and that's okay. So as always, take what resonates for you. So when we do this work of exploring the inner worlds, I work with psychedelic therapy with psilocybin. We're exploring our inner worlds, the subconscious, and luckily we stand on the shoulders of giants. In the 20th century, there was many great explorers of the inner worlds, the psychologists like Freud, like Carl Jung, Maslow, the transpersonal psychologists like Stan Grof. And we're going to look today at some of these maps that they created. And here's a photo of Carl Jung and a Tibetan Buddhist mandala, which is a representation of the inner worlds. And this photo on the right is from his red book, when he had his break with Freud, when he began really exploring his inner world, and he drew this painting of his inner world, the cosmic egg. So when we explore our inner worlds, we're not the first people to go there. In the 20th century, there was many psychologists who explored this, based then on the mystical traditions, usually of the East and West. So let's start at the beginning. Why do we need psychological maps of consciousness? Well, the main reason we need any map is so that we don't get lost. We don't get lost. So maps help us find a way in the terrain of the psyche, in the terrain of the mystical. Joseph Campbell said the mystic is swimming in the same territory as the psychotic is drowning in. So maps help us find our way, whether we're exploring this through psychedelics, through plant medicine, through breath work, through dreams. It's all the same terrain. Okay, so this is the classic Freudian map of the subconscious or psyche. So Freud's great contribution was that he identified that the subconscious, like an iceberg, most of our behavior is driven by our unconscious, which is 90% below the surface. And of course, Freud came up with the classic division between the ego, the id, and the superego. So this is his simplified version of the Freudian unconscious. If we look at this very simple diagram here, the id is the reptilian desires, our reptilian desire, our million-year-old self, our primal desires. The ego is what we present to the world, and the superego is our conditioned responses, our morality, our inner critic that has been informed by our social and cultural conditioning, our family conditioning. I work with many clients from different cultural backgrounds. Recently, I was working with a woman from an Orthodox Jewish background who had a really strong cultural conditioning, very strong inner critic. So whether that's from a Catholic background, a Muslim background, a Judaic background, sometimes that conditioning can be incredibly strong in our lives and can really inform a lot of our conflicts and behavior through this conditioned morality that we all come in with on one level or another. So that's the classic Freudian, and Freud spoke about the personal unconscious. So that was his great contribution. Moving on from Freud, then we have, of course, Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist, and he moved on from the personal unconscious to the collective unconscious. So this idea that humanity has a shared memory. So if our personal unconscious is everything that's ever happened to us in our lives, from birth to the current moment, everything that we ever has happened to us and that we've forgotten, that's in our personal unconscious. The collective unconscious could be called everything that's ever happened, the collective memory of humanity. So everything that's ever happened to humanity is stored in the collective unconscious. So just a photo there of Jung with a mandala. So here's a more detailed map of the Jungian psyche. So the persona is, what we project out into the world, the masks that we wear, the labels, which are necessary, but not always, they're not our real self. They're just a mask which protects the ego. And on the left there, you can see there's the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious, Jung was fascinated by the building blocks, the psychic building blocks of humanity, which stretch back into the 2 million-year-old self, he called it, into the muddy roots of humanity. So deep into our ancient, Stone Age, pre-Stone Age memory of humanity. And he was fascinated by what he called the archetypes. The archetypes, he believed, were the psychic building blocks of humanity. So there's the archetype of the mother, the father, the archetype of the lover, the trickster. These are cross-cultural phenomena that exist pretty much in every culture because they're deeply rooted in our ancestral memory as human beings. He also spoke, of course, about the shadow in the unconscious, and the shadow is that what we repress, that what we suppress, that what we disown in ourselves. The shadow, of course, is not always negative. It can be positive. So, for example, if your voice is suppressed, if you're unable to express yourself, to sing, to express yourself clearly, it could be said that your voice is in the shadow. So your ability to communicate is in your shadow. And Jung, of course, said that there was gold to be found in the shadow. Yeah. So Jung believed that the goal of life was individuation, which is the integration of the different aspects of the self to be more in alignment with our true self. And he also believed that human beings seek homeostasis, which is balance and growth. Okay. So yeah, just to emphasize that. So the collective unconscious is the deposit of ancestral experience of humanity. The shared heritage of what it is to be human. And in the psychedelic work we do, and we work with a lot of groups, so it can be very common for people to have experiences. Most common experiences would be experiences of the personal unconscious, so things that happened to the person in the past. But then on from that, it's also very common to have experiences of the collective unconscious. So, for example, people having experiences of the deep pain and suffering of the earth. Or we had one client in the Netherlands, an Irish client, and Ireland did not really participate in the Second World War. And he had no direct family lineage or link with the Second World War. But when he came on a psychedelic retreat, he ended up having this deep experience of the pain and suffering of the German and Dutch people during the Second World War. And in the integration of the experience, he felt that he was having an experience of the collective unconscious, not his personal unconscious, but more the collective unconscious. Okay. Yeah, and Jung also believed that the unconscious wants to flow into consciousness, so that often, these parts of ourselves come upwelling in our lives through dreams or through our behavior. And, it can be quite overwhelming when the unconscious comes up to the surface. So the work is really around making conscious what is unconscious. I like this idea or this comment that these are the structural elements of the human psyche and are inherited. We're born with them. We're born with them. Okay. This is another map of the same thing, Jung's collective unconscious. He also brings in, of course, the anima and the animus there, which are the contrasexual parts of ourselves. So if you're a woman, that inner masculine element, and if you're a man, the anima, the inner feminine. And Jung believed, if he said, some of the deeper work, inner work that we can do after the shadow work, another deeper layer is around connecting to our anima and animus. And Jung believed that if we don't do this inner work, we'll find a partner to project our anima, our animus onto, and that can have a very negative effect on our life. He said, he said this idea of falling in love straight away with someone. He said, if that happens, what should you do? And his answer was, you should run, because really what was happening was a projection of the inner anima or animus onto another person. So obviously there's so much we could talk about here. Does any of this resonate? Just checking in with people. Any comments straight away? Any thoughts or questions? I mean, we could speak for hours in each one of these slides, but it's going to cover. If anyone wants to come in at any stage, just with a comment, please do. Okay. So as I said, when he broke with Freud, Jung underwent through this process of, you could call it spiritual emergence. He almost went into a psychosis where the elements of his own unconscious began spilling out, and he went into isolation. He was completely cut off, ostracized almost from the therapeutic community. And during that time, he painted and drew a lot of these images that came up like mandalas from his own psyche. And this is a very famous one from the Red Book, his great book at that time. And what I like to show you is just how similar this is to the shamanic worldview. So this is the shamanic map of consciousness, Siberian shaman here. Shaman being one of the oldest spiritual traditions, you could say, in the world. It's cross-cultural, it's universal in every culture. And most shamanic traditions talk about this cosmic tree, and the lower world, the upper world, and the middle world. So 3 layers of consciousness. And if you look, it's pretty much identical to what Jung identified in himself. The upper world, this where, light beings or angelic beings, if you want to use that language, reside. The middle world is this reality. The lower world is where we go for inspiration, guidance, healing, where our spirit animals reside. And what I'm interested in is how, all these cultures and different backgrounds, people come up with more or less the same symbolism, because this symbolism is so deeply ingrained in our psyches. Then following on from Jung, there was Roberto Assagioli, and he came up with this cosmic egg diagram. And he was a student of Freud and a student of Jung. He was an Italian psychiatrist. And what I really like about Assagioli, he developed this psychosynthesis form of psychology. What I really like about Assagioli is he brought in the ideas from Freud and from Jung, but he also brought in this idea of the self, or emphasized it, that the higher self was the aspect of ourself on a higher plane that has this wisdom and intelligence that we can learn to tune into and guide us in our everyday lives. So Roberto Assagioli and Jung were both heavily influenced by Eastern philosophy, which of course had been saying something similar to this for thousands of years. Assagioli also spoke about the multi-dimensional nature of the human psyche and how the various parts of one's consciousness relate to another. Does anyone have an experience of the higher self or connecting to your higher self? Does this resonate?
Yes.
Want to come in there, Simon?
Well, first I mean I thought I did that with plant medicine, and in the last couple of years I found a way to connect to my higher self through meditation, and sometimes even in daily life. Oh, yes, not like I mean I'm always connected. The thing is, if I realize it and I can feel it, but it's there. Yes.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's something happens, isn't it, when you feel like you're being guided by your higher self, that we're no longer being guided by our subconscious or unconscious desires. So if we think of the majority of humanity for the past several thousand years, perhaps we've been driven by our, our lower desires, our instincts. And if we continue, the work, I suppose, for us as human beings is to raise our consciousness so that we are able to operate from a place of a higher place. Yeah. And I think, most of us on this call will have experience of that, of course. So you know what it feels like when we're operating from that place of higher self rather than our lower instinctual desires, or, without suppressing or denying. It's about integrating, about owning all these parts of ourselves.
Would it be
Could you
like,
say,
Hmm?
sorry, I
Go-
was just gonna say, could you also say, maybe what comes to mind when I hear you say that is kind of that check-in when you realize that feeling of maybe I'm operating from this higher self. It's like, am I acting or speaking or moving in this world from a place of love or a place of fear? Is kind of what it sounds like to me. This higher self, or this.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful. We're operating from a place of love. Yeah, I love that. So one of the beautiful parts of this type of psychology is that, we're going up, we're trying to, of course, we need to work with our traumas and our, conditioning, and there's a real need for that in psychotherapy and psychology. But the Jung and Assagioli were more focused on how do we grow and what are we growing towards. So Jung said that this type of work, he said, only usually happens in the second half of life. In the first half of life, we're just finding our way. He said about the age of 40, usually for people anyway, that we begin to consider more these questions of individuation. Of course, it can happen sooner than that, especially these days as people are more and more and more conscious. Yeah. So Assagioli also spoke about, higher levels of consciousness being the awareness of species level consciousness. So that humans are moving towards this consciousness of, eco-consciousness, where we're part of nature and away from this deeply egotistical separation of the skin encapsulated ego that Freud talked about. So, yeah. And, most of you have heard of IFS, internal family systems theory. I'm sure some of you've experienced it. Maybe some of you are therapists. But I just want to mention that IFS, internal family systems, basically developed the ideas of Assagioli and took them. He renamed these parts that Assagioli talked about. They renamed them the exiles, the firefighters, and managers. But these concepts basically came from psychosynthesis. And just, this, for those not familiar with it, IFS is a really beautiful and powerful method or map of the inner worlds. And what I like about IFS is it's pretty simple. Jungian psychology can get pretty complex, but for me, IFS is a simple map. So the exiles, or I like to use the word, the wounded children or the inner children that are in pain, or the shamed parts that are hidden, protected, deeply vulnerable. And you could say, the shame is in the shadow. And I'm Irish, so I like to say Irish people, we have PhDs in shame when we were born, with their Catholic colonial upbringing. So, what is shame? Shame is the parts of us in the shadow that are hidden, suppressed, that we won't show to anyone. And I'm also really interested in how in different cultures that manifests in different ways. So
Brazilians don't have?
yeah, I don't think Brazilians have any shame. That's what Kalyani likes to say. I think it might be true in her case, but I don't know. There's other Brazilians here. You can tell me, what does shame manifest like in your culture? In Ireland, it's just like keeping up appearances, trying to pretend everything's fine, don't talk about it. And the alcoholism and all the things that come with that.
I think it's the Western world or Europe, it's quite universal, no?
Yes. I've noticed there's some differences, like in Slavic countries, people of, Eastern Europe, there tends to be more a perfectionist type streak. you know, all of these are ways of protecting the shame. So the manager is the protector of the system, the, you know, the controller, the caretaker, the self-critic, the one who takes care of everything. You know, these are the parts that can come up to protect the exiles. And then the firefighters are ways of, you know, the addictions and the ways of keeping us from feeling our pain. So does that map of consciousness particularly resonate for anyone?
I think I'm a manager.
I think you might have to manager. Kalyani definitely has a managing streak, which is great. Yeah, sometimes.
I think I've been in my life, I've been part of each.
Yeah.
I think it depends when you at which phase in your life you were.
Oh, absolutely. We all have all of these inside of us.
Can I talk of something?
Sure.
So about the phases of life, when Rob talked about Jung, I think it was that you mentioned, or Sajoli, I don't know. No, Sajoli, that he says that this wanting or starting a process towards individuation comes later in life, on the second phase of life. Like in Hinduism, they talk a lot about, also in the yoga tradition, these phases of life, which I think is very beautiful and might go a little bit off the subject, but still it ties up into this respecting each one's timing, in this wheel of life, in this map of consciousness that we are growing progressively. Our last class, we talked about chakras as maps of consciousness. So we go into each phases of life as well.